Good afternoon, all. Steve.Parisi here with IBC Global. I hope your day is off to a fantastic start. Today, we've got a guest and my good friend, Mr. Brock Bales. How are you today, Brock?
I'm doing good, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for hopping on. We're going to have some fun today as we are discussing the concept of the family office. We'll be talking about what it is. There's a lot of questions I want to ask you about specifically because I know your firm does deal with this quite a bit. But to kick things off, I think it would be beneficial to talk about the two types of family offices because this does come up sometimes. Would you like to start there?
So essentially there's two types, single family and multifamily. As the name would suggest, it's a family office for a family or potentially a larger group related, two sides of the family tree, etc. And then multifamily is usually an institution or a vendor providing family office type services to lots of different families in the market. So think the difference between a private and a public facing organization. The multifamily, I think, it's often an investment advisor taking an AUM percentage and providing some other level of service. Sometimes it's very minimal extra services, and sometimes it's very robust services down to bookkeeping and hospitality related things, etc. Um, but we mostly deal with single family offices at our firm.
Got it. And that's really what I want to dig into detail on because this is what I get questions about all the time. I know our entire firm does, all of our associates do as well. So let's start very broad and then we can zoom in a bit. So, at a high level, what is the purpose of a family office? Solely focusing on single family offices.
So maybe I'll back up a little bit and just
Yeah.
talk about history. So I mean, if we go back hundreds and hundreds of years, essentially monarchs were running their own iteration of a family office. It's this concept of how do you pass this kingdom from one generation to the next. And then the Rockefellers sort of modernized that concept. And so when we talk about a family office, most people they'll say something in an email to us when they're introduced and say, we want to do something like the Rockefellers and this concept of a family office. And that term, where it's codified, is with the Investment Advisors Act in 1940, which says that if you are a family office, which means you are an investment advisory sort of group, um, you're just servicing one client. So you're an organization that's providing services to one group. You don't have to be regulated under the Advisors Act because you only serve family clients. You don't serve the public. So because of that, you're subject to less, sort of regulatory oversight. So because I think that's where the definition is codified, and then there's this concept of the Rockefellers. When people think family offices, they tend to think investment advisory type services, managing wealth, investing assets, etc. And if you talk to people who work in finance, they may say, I work for a family office. And when you dig down into it, they're usually reviewing investments, prospectuses, whatever, and figuring out how to allocate wealth. We define a family office broader than that. We define it as the infrastructure by which a family or a group of families manages, invests, and administers their wealth over multiple generations. Another way to think of it is it's just the purpose of it is to protect, um, control, manage wealth with, continuity over a different, period of time. So the purpose of it is different for each family. So when we think about it in that context, um, if you go to most groups who are providing family office type services, there's going to be sort of in our diagram of the services, most of it will be this big blob of investment advisory type work, and then these smaller other components. And when we work with clients, we sort of assume that they have that handled. They've built these incredible businesses. They have people that they're, and we can introduce them to advisors, et cetera. But we're building the entire sort of holistic structure, not just that piece. So that could be bookkeeping, it could be administrative work, it could be lifestyles type services like private security or chartering a plane or a yacht or whatever. It could be sort of a philanthropic, charitable endeavor, legal, CFO work, essentially
Got it.
problem solving. So the family office is sort of the nexus where the family eliminates its own friction in its life and solves its own problems, whatever they
Yeah.
may be.
Mhm.
Hopefully that gives you more of a feel for how we approach it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you going through the detail on that too. So how I've always looked at it is you're able to bring all of your services and needs under one umbrella. So for example, if I am someone without a family office, I have my insurance advisor, my wealth manager, my real estate broker, my tax attorney, my CPA, all that I've gone out and independently found, and they all may have very, very different opinions. And I, as a client, sometimes feel stuck in the middle because their advice might contradict one another. And I'm like, well, I don't really know what to do. I just want the advisors to tell me what to do. This happens all the time where people get confused. So the concept of a family office helps bring all of those professionals, and correct me if I'm wrong here, under one umbrella, where now the client has these trusted advisors that are all unified or at least somewhat communicating with each other, if not fully communicating with each other, to ensure that I, the client, make the best possible decision with any financial move. Is that correct, or would you
Y-
correct me there?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it takes various forms. Like that team could all be on one entity's payroll, and that
Yeah,
is the family office. It could be that really you have a structure that's more loosely designed, but you still have the same bench or team, all with a specific task.
yeah,
So that's why we like defining it as the infrastructure by which a family controls, manages, and administers its wealth, because it's not any one product or solution or structure. You know, each person's bench of advisors and that client's specific skill set may obviate the need for certain advisors, and different family members' skill sets. So um, it just takes different forms depending on the family.
I gotcha. Thanks for that. And you've got multiple advisors in the majority of cases.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's hard to find, and this is where I think our firm is helpful because we like to view ourselves as a quarterback where you have all these different advisors on a bench, but someone has to receive the play from the coach,
right.
initiate the play, make sure everybody's in the right place before hike the ball and throw the pass or whatever, and then follow up with people and say, I needed you to run your route a little bit different, whatever it was. Make sure you pick up this block. Um, and so that sort of interaction is helpful because what can happen is as people become more and more specialized in each of their fields,
Yeah,
people sort of isolate in their own little echo chamber, which, when you see this happen in a family office, they tend to get dominated by one thing. Maybe that's the investment advisor who's sort of driving the ship. And that could be a fine solution, but there's other things like is it tax efficient? Is it legally structured correctly? I know you made a great investment, but did we administer that investment and record the transaction correctly and put it in the right entity? And is it in the right trust? On and on and on the list goes. And that's where having that sort of nexus point is so helpful. And you can't have that without, the right clarity creating functions so you can
yeah,
see everything that you own, the right control functions so you can actually initiate a plan and follow through with it. and then some sort of continuity function where you're actually following and auditing your procedures and making them,
Yeah.
you know,
Got
flow
it.
correctly.
Got it. The control piece, when you mention that word, like that's a big thing that I'm interested in. I know a lot of others are interested in as well, just to make sure everything's used in a responsible manner. So the concept of generational wealth, you mentioned the Rockefellers, what they are really the benchmark for, the example that everyone wants to imitate. When you look at a family office and its role in ensuring that a family can pass wealth from generation to generation, how does that typically work? Like, I know control is a big piece, but is it specifically trust documents that are put in place? If I, the insurance agent, think that, hey, this policy on this family member would be fantastic, can they just do it on their own? Or does it have to go through a certain procedure first and need to be approved by the family or family office before it can actually be executed? Like, how much of that control do you have embedded in the plan?
So this is where the design of the actual architecture of the system could be so different
Yeah.
for each family. So if you take the concept of an entity, which is an avatar that can own its own assets and act and have employees, etc. You have this concept of a trust, which is just a relationship between a settlor, a trustee, and a beneficiary. And you put those concepts together, you can get so many different structures that serve all these different purposes: estate tax planning, gift tax planning, income tax planning, asset protection. But if we, and so it's hard to say what each family is
Yeah.
doing because it's so different. So if we draw back, and each family is going to have sort of this worldview or underlying principle by which that family acts. So by saying you want to benefit one generation to another, we're already presuming that that family has some sort of longevity, legacy creating concept. When some families,
Yeah.
they just want to give, they don't want to give any wealth to their children. They want to give it straight to a charity or a church or university or whatever it is. And so if we align first on what is the client's why and their
Mhm.
worldview, what is the legacy that they're trying to create, that can educate us on what sort of infrastructure makes sense, what will feel right. Then you can kind of move into, well, if we look at history, like the Rockefellers, for example, and you could go back even further in history of, which people successfully handed wealth from one generation to the next. What did they do well? We can draw lessons from that. And then cultivating a bench of wise, unconflicted advisors who can help you think through what structure makes the most sense for me and my family. Then once we align on that, we can actually put the infrastructure in place, where it could be in your example of buying an insurance policy.
Yeah.
It could be you have a number of trusts, each serving a different purpose, that own various groups of assets that are being managed by potentially a trust company or the family office in the sense of the SEC definition, a management entity, and these various holdcos. And so if you as the insurance advisor came in, one family could have a board at a trust company level who would receive that and determine which trust is the best acquirer of this asset. Where do we get the liquidity from? Maybe it's inside of an entity. Well, if it's inside of an entity, do we have incidents of ownership that draws it into an estate? There's all these different things. And if we've set up the infrastructure where we can go to the right group of people to ask the right questions,
Yeah.
and they have all the right information to consider, you can start making really informed, educated decisions within the context of that undergirding principle of what's driving the family forward. And and I don't know, that's a long-winded answer,
That's okay.
but
Yeah. All good.
I absolutely love these concepts because it's
Yeah.
it's not just, there's so many principals interacting with each other, where
Yeah,
it's just the type of problem I like to try to solve
I
with
gotcha.
families and help them solve. Because when they solve it and it makes sense, you see the friction in their life start to evaporate because they're able to act and make decisions in a way that is aligned not just with the legal aspects or the tax aspects or whatever, but their own principles, which is,
Hmm.
it's a really cool type of project to work on.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, it's definitely interesting. So here's a case study that I see quite a bit. Someone I work with came from nothing. By the time they're 60 years old or close to 60, they've built a net worth between 3 to 5 million, and now they're really figuring out how to grow their assets. By the time they're 70 or 80, that might be worth 10 million. And the one thing they say is, I wish that I had another 30 years because then I could really just propel this thing. So what they want to do, what they'll bring up with me is how can I set something up where when I pass, the money and how I manage it now continues to be managed in the same way, or at least with the way that I know works, and it's not going to get wasted on something stupid. How can I ensure that my kids continue to do that? Meaning, I want the money to be passed to the kids and then eventually to the grandkids. And what I don't want to do is just give them a check for 3 million or 5 million, whatever, and then they go buy a mansion and a really cool car and it's gone. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like what might be a very, call it basic step or step one that someone like that could put in place just to ensure that the money isn't squandered?
So we're starting with a presumption that
Yeah,
if you give children an immense amount of control over immense amount of assets, they'll squander,
right.
which is an interesting presumption because if you've raised incredible children, who better to give your wealth and continue your legacy than your own children? You could give it to an investment advisor or a group
Yeah,
of advisors and they'll do a good job. They'll be more expensive than children. But that's one of the things where I'm understanding the family dynamic first will drive
yeah,
some of those things because some infrastructure um, could be very restrictive to the children,
hmm,
designed to sort of protect them from themselves, which I think makes a lot of sense if you know if you gave your children a check or if you gave them unfettered control. Now, granted, depending on what the infrastructure in the family office looks like, they could have control, but not necessarily ownership because it's in a trust, it's held with a trustee. There's they could be the trustee, maybe they're not the trustee. There's so many different things. So if we just think about it conceptually, ideally, you would have assets within a structure that is outside of their estate. So it's growing without estate tax friction.
yeah,
It's subject to some form of limitation that provides an asset protection benefit. So not an outright check, obviously.
hmm,
You could do that, which we've seen families do because they just think kids are going to make their own decisions, etc. Um, but if you're setting up an estate tax efficient vehicle, an asset protection efficient vehicle, a tax efficient vehicle, there's probably some infrastructure that the children are interacting with and exercising some sort of indirect influence over the structure. Maybe it's because they're communicating to a board what they want or what their lifestyle is, and the board is, you know, answering
yeah,
that call and exercising their fiduciary duty. Or maybe it's the children acting as a board or individually controlled their own separate structure. So,
hmm,
um, but the idea of if you've reached the point in your life where you have this wealth and you want to give it to your children, and your children don't have the capacity to handle it, you have a problem because now you
yeah,
have to find someone else with capacity to manage it, as opposed to someone who was able to start building skill set into their children early on, or maybe they were participatory in building whatever generated the wealth, like maybe they were building the business with you. those people have an easier solution because their kids already have skill sets and capabilities, etc. It's like that, verse in Proverbs where it says, do you see a man skillful in his work? He'll stand before kings. He won't stand before obscure men. Well, if you've cultivated a skill set in your children, they're going to be able to inherit your wealth and
Yeah.
10x it just like you did in your life and cumulative return rates, etc.
Yeah.
But if your children are not skillful, you have a whole nother problem you have to solve for. And
Yeah.
that's where putting guardrails up, like when you're bowling, you can put the little bumpers up so they don't fall in the gutter constantly.
Hmm.
So some of our clients, they're older and they have younger children. Um, you have to necessarily put that infrastructure up because they can't inherit this wealth at 18, 19, etc. You have to put gutters up where
Yeah.
they slowly get educated and skilled to be able to take the reins of the structure.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah. And so on that point, for example, if you've got parents that pass while the kids are still very young, they might have a good head on their shoulders, but they're not ready to manage a business or have access to a huge amount of money. W- What are some examples of guardrails or something that might be put in place where the parents say, "Hey, I want my child to always be comfortable, but at the same time, I also want them to be responsible."
Yeah. So a fairly typical structure is if the children are not up to a certain age, let's say 21, for example, or
Yeah.
25,
Mhm.
they would have essentially no control over the structure that exists because the
Okay.
presumption is your frontal lobe hasn't developed, you haven't gotten out of college, we don't know whether or not you're going to be responsible as an individual, etc. And then at that point, there could be a second level that happens where they're brought in more. Maybe they become a co-trustee, so they don't get to make decisions by themselves, but they're participatory in a group.
Mm,
And then
got it.
that could look so many different ways, but that could be an example. They could be brought into if it's a much larger family office, it could be that they're brought in as an employee and they're slowly cultivated into the systems and they're brought up in how that family office is growing. And maybe they gravitate to a certain area. Maybe it's investment advisory, maybe it's back office sort of accounting, maybe it's HR. Different children may migrate to different aspects of the family office.
Mhm.
And then there could be another tranche, which is they've proven themselves, they've hit a certain age, maybe that's 35, maybe that's 40. I don't know. It's different for each family.
Yeah.
And at that point, they step into sort of a complete control. They're able to exercise discretion over their own assets. They're potentially the president of the family office. They're a board member of the family office, however it's structured.
I got you.
And they're able to, hopefully responsibly exercise influence. It's hard because wealth is just a lever. If
Yeah.
if you're skillful, it's going to make you apply a ton of leverage and be very effective. If you're lazy or incompetent, the lever is just going to magnify that and you're going to squander at a faster pace. So it's those concepts, it's there's an art to it, and each family concludes differently with how
Hmm.
it makes sense for them.
So let's say that I've built a real estate portfolio. I have kids. They buy and sell real estate with me. However, right now, the family's net worth grows because I know what I'm doing. I know how to find the deals. I know how to negotiate them. I know the real estate game inside and out. If I pass, a concern of mine is that my kids are okay at what they're doing, but if they have to buy a, a difficult property or a complicated one on their own, they could easily make some bad moves, and it's a concern of mine. So, can I put some type of protection in place that says, hey, if I pass tomorrow, or until my children are the ages of 25, 30, or can demonstrate that they can buy and sell real estate with the same ability as me, that every decision or every purchase they make, purchase and sale, they need to consult with this individual who is a former partner of mine or it's an advisor that knows real estate like me. But this way, I build in a safeguard there so someone can help them continue to make responsible decisions. This way, bad decisions aren't made because I'm gone. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. And that it is, you could definitely establish that sort of functionality. So
Nice. Yeah.
if you um while you're alive, you could retain complete control, delegate functions to your children, educate them, articulate your buying procedure, development procedure, etc. And I've seen really cool documents where patriarchs or matriarchs have sort of written out, created a manual of here's how, um, this is the system I follow. This is the procedures. This is the questions I ask. Here's my due diligence checklist, where they've created these things and then they've trained their children in them. And then obviously the children can follow along and learn. And what's difficult is if, there's a premature death where if you're just anticipating the worst, or potentially your children are still quite young and they were in high school, or, they're not working in your business as much as you'd like them to be able to run it after you're gone. Well, in that case, having a great advisor group or a single individual or someone who could help them and potentially has different, we could figure out how it's structured. Is it that that person's just on a board and he gets to participate in the meeting and your children respect him or her and they'll listen to them just naturally, even though he doesn't have a veto? Or it could be that that person is on the other end of the spectrum. They make all the decisions, they're in control, and the children are just along for the ride for a period of time. And then there's something in the middle where maybe it's, they're 50-50, and so they
Right.
have to agree to make a decision. Um, it just depends on what makes sense, or how much you trust that other individual, how much you trust your children. It will lead you to the right solution. But certainly we could create infrastructure, um, and another law firm or another
Yeah.
advisor could create infrastructure where you would be protected in that scenario, or at least you'd feel like your children were protected. Um, Now, again, any infrastructure is only as good as it's being used. So it's sort
Yeah.
of like Ben Franklin's quote, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." It's like, I gave you this amazing infrastructure. It's only as good as the people using it. So if you have tremendous team that are really skilled, they understand the plan, you've communicated it well, the assumption is that they're going to continue this legacy and follow along with the plan and use all of the benefits of the infrastructure, etc. If you have a terrible team, it's just gonna, doesn't matter how good of a system we give them, it's gonna fall apart. And
Mhm.
that's hard because neither you or I, as an advisor, can find people and cultivate really good relationships for people. They have to do that on their own.
Yeah.
And that can be hard. The other thing that I think this is a good, and stop me if I should stop, but there's this concept of an entrepreneur built an incredible business. And that is essentially the thing that's generating the wealth or was sold to generate the wealth, right? The family office is not that business.
Right.
It's a different business. And what oftentimes we see happen is the two spheres, let's say it's the business sphere and the family office sphere, they're they're just conflated together
Got
and
it.
they're not the same thing. So to the question you've asked, you could have, and I've seen this happen, where the business is just one asset in the family office portfolio. And the business has a CEO or a president or a board, and they're running this company. I've seen this happen with large, billion-dollar construction companies where they have someone is running that business. The children are involved to some degree, maybe they're board members, but they don't need to be as involved. They have a team running, let's say, the entrepreneur's business. But then the children are very involved in the management and investment and cultivation of the assets that are thrown off by that business. So sometimes there's this separation of spheres that need to take place
Yeah.
between the business as one piece of the portfolio within the family office. And sometimes that can help because maybe there is a board or an advisor who's just going to run that company and do a great job and receive a salary or maybe some form of equity comp to motivate them. And the children are just going to take those assets and reinvest them into whatever their heart is, whatever they're involved in. Maybe it's in a different line of business that they're growing. Um, but that might help answer the question as well, is
Yeah.
depending on how it's structured, you could have a dichotomy between, let's say, the business and the family office.
Yeah, I gotcha. Thanks for that. And a lot of times, like when I speak with folks, they don't even know where to start. Usually they're looking for ideas as to what others do. I like to keep things simple. So a lot of times I'll use myself as an example where we've got the business on one side of things, but then personally, like my big concern is if something were to happen to me. My wife Tara is lovely. She always tries to help everyone. So a concern would be is if I passed, she receives a large sum of money through the life insurance policies and such. All of a sudden, everyone would be asking her, hey, you should do this with this money over here for these different investments and such. And out of a willingness to want to help and to help that person wherever possible, she'd say, okay. And then if it's for some, weird crypto startup that makes no sense or it's a scam, whatever it might be. So what I had done with you guys was put in a provision in the trust where she's paid a salary, and then if she needs more money, she can get it. However, first, she consults with two individuals just to discuss what is the reason you need or want this additional money. And that's mainly there to make sure that it's not because someone is asking for it and just wants to invest in something with zero business plan whatsoever. So that was something I put in place just to make very simple. I should say you put in place for me after we discussed it.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a perfect example of a guardrail that makes sense in
Yeah.
your family's context. It just different spouses have different skill sets. My wife has different skill sets than me. Another couple, they're going to have a different context. Sometimes it's the wife driving different aspects of the business instead of the husband. It just depends on the role. Sometimes they built it together.
Yeah.
Um, that is a perfect example, Steve, of understanding your family's context, their purpose, the legacy, and then setting up guardrails based on potential, weak points. So that way you're sure that the ball is always going towards, we're trying to get strikes here as
Yeah.
much as possible while we're bowling. Um, but you put up a guardrail that made sense. Okay, this will ensure that the ball's always heading down the right way, and that I trust, the people that I've put as advisors and my wife to make good decisions, and they're going to do the best they can with the infrastructure you created.
Got
And
it.
then similarly with your business, there's infrastructure by which your business it require, and this is really important for doctors and lawyers, etc. Your business cannot be owned by your spouse if she or he is not licensed. So
Yes.
you have to have succession planning built into your business, separate from your estate plan, where maybe there's an insurance policy designed to provide liquidity to buy you out so your partner can take over, or enough money to hire a CEO to get the business to sale. There's these aspects where, my wife would never want to run our law
Right.
firm. Never. She's not going to go to law school and you can get a law degree, etc. So our law firm has to have key man insurance and it has to have the ability to function until it can be handed off to another lawyer.
Yeah.
Similarly, with medical practices and other regulated businesses, this is where the holistic integration of the plan comes together because the trust has to integrate with the LLC operating agreement, and that has to be practical. Where do we get the liquidity to buy this person out? Maybe that's an insurance policy. There's all this interacts with each other,
Yeah.
um, and it's just different for each family.
Yeah, I do have some questions on that, but we can save those for another time. So here's a question that comes up quite a bit. Owning assets in my name, whether it's me or an LLC that I own and control, versus owning assets inside of a trust. Like if I'm concerned about generational wealth and passing money from one generation to the next, a lot of times I'll have folks that reach out and ask, hey, can I put everything under a trust from the get-go? Because I want to do what the Rockefellers have done. I guess my answer would be, well, you can, but you definitely want to measure the pros and cons of that and see where you're at just in terms of a level of net worth right now. So I guess maybe we can talk through a little bit of the pros and cons with respect to owning assets inside of a trust and why someone would do that and when it makes sense to do that.
We get this question a lot too.
Yeah,
And a lot of it is driven by social media posts or whatever's popular at that time, drives clients to ask questions.
yeah,
And they're really good questions. But I want to just a lot of that is driven by people selling products.
yeah,
They want to sell a specific type of trust to the client, and there's some purported benefit, etc. Our firm does not do that. We do the exact opposite. We do not sell products at all.
right.
We are true fiduciary advisors that are unconflicted in what we're selling, which is all we're selling is our time. So it's a
Mhm.
very different model. So when I hear questions like that, the first thing I want to try to figure out is where is it coming from? Because
Yeah,
sometimes in the back of their mind, they're thinking, if I hear Brock say this, I'm going to go buy this product.
right.
And
Mhm.
that's where I want to be really careful. So a trust is just a relationship. It's a relationship between the settler who forms the trust, prepares the instrument, usually through a lawyer, that sets the paradigm of the relationship. The person who receives the assets in the trust and has a fiduciary duty to the settler and the beneficiary to follow the trust's plan is called the trustee. The person who receives the benefit from the exercise of that trustee's discretion and the appreciation of the wealth is not the trustee because he's just a fiduciary, it's the beneficiary.
Yeah,
That's a trust relationship. That is a very flexible thing. It's not a product. There are so many levers and switches of how we can design that to create all different sorts of benefits. So one of the benefits could be if you're willing to give up control and give control to another person who holds title to your assets, that's a trustee. Now all of a sudden, that asset's not in my name and I don't have control over the asset. Person X does.
mhm.
That provides a level of asset protection. And we can increase and decrease it based on the jurisdiction of the trust and the provisions of the trust and what level of control, what the distribution standard is, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, putting an asset inside of a trust can provide various benefits, but there's corresponding downsides. If I give you, Steve, complete control over my trust, I don't have control over the assets anymore. You do.
Right.
So I
Mhm.
have to literally trust you to exercise discretion for my family's benefit. So there is a pro and con to that. I just created a structure that provides a level of benefit to me, but it had a downside. I don't have as much control anymore. So we're playing with these different tools to design something that makes sense um, for that family and their client.
Yeah, I gotcha. I mean, if I don't have a super high net worth and call it an estate tax liability, and I just want to make sure that the money's used responsibly, could I just name a trust the beneficiary of my assets and then have it spelled out exactly how those assets are paid out to the family if and when, in
So
order to try to keep things
y-
simple? Yeah,
yeah, the prototypical estate plan structure
yeah,
of an entrepreneur who hasn't hit the critical mass of having an estate tax, which is for husband and wife, it's 30 million index for
yeah,
inflation, 15 each. So that's a pretty decent sum. Most of the clients we're working with structuring family offices are well in excess of that.
yeah,
If you're beneath that threshold, you don't have an estate tax problem. You have an estate planning problem, which the usual structure is a will that pours over into a revocable management trust. The management, that's just a probate substitute, will substitute mechanism. There's no asset protection benefit. It's literally just a will substitute where the trust specifies who's in control, where the assets go, etc. What happens if my whole family's passed away? Where does it go to? What charities, what churches, whatever those it is. That's a pretty typical structure. And then you couple that with insurance, you couple that with TOD, transfer on death designations, and your retirement plans and bank accounts and investment accounts. So everything pours into this trust where it can then be distributed in whatever way is most beneficial to your family. And then you couple that finally with your business. You have good buy sell provisions that address what happens if you die so your partner can take over. There's a buyout, whatever mechanism makes the most sense. That is a very standard, well tested, used all across America plan for families. And then as we approach that estate tax structure, that's when things start getting more complicated. There's usually more types of trusts, there's various entities. As your wealth grows, the complications involved with it grow too. And so does your family office structure.
I, the simple question is, why does it have to be so complex? Perhaps we could answer that in more detail next time, because I know that,
Well, it,
that,
it doesn't
yeah,
it doesn't have to be
yeah,
complexity without understanding and without good coaching feels like friction.
yeah,
Complexity where there's a ton of clarity and education and you understand what it is that you're doing and why does not feel like friction.
hmm,
And that's where if you're buying a product, you tend to buy friction into your life. If you are developing a system with advisors that you trust over a period of time that makes sense, you end up with infrastructure that does not feel like friction, but quite the opposite. It generates momentum. Um, it creates what you need to move forward. So yes, it is complicated in the sense that maybe there are multiple trusts and entities, and it's all interacting with each other, and we have to keep records, and that requires technological infrastructure. Um,
yeah,
but hopefully, it's all achieving a very worthwhile end, and the cost to put it in place is well less than the cost of an estate tax, for example, or the cost of a bad structure that's exposed to creditors. Um, the
got it,
cost of a structure with no guide rails to prevent family members from making terrible decisions in the future by accident. So
I
yes,
gotcha.
yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, no, I appreciate that. So here's a question for you. If you've got someone with a $100 million net worth and they've grown that pretty quickly through real estate and assets that are somewhat illiquid, right? They don't have a ton of cash, or that's not a large percentage of their net worth. If if they could go back in time and do things differently, but let's assume the $100 million net worth, they don't have anything inside of a trust, or they haven't revisited it in a long time. If they could go back in time, like what I hear in some cases is, hey, if I could have gotten some of these assets inside of a trust from the get-go before they appreciated, that would have really helped me from an estate tax liability. And that's the part where I hear, I'm like, oh, okay, that's good, but I'm not a tax attorney. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? So firstly, I hope that makes sense, but like, why would
Yeah,
someone
it's
express that? Go ahead.
my partner Elizabeth has
Yeah,
this phrase that says the estate tax is an elective tax, which means you pay it because you didn't plan properly.
right.
That's essentially why you pay it. The hard part is if you've built a massive amount of wealth, we can't go back in time.
Correct.
And what we have in the United States is what is called a unified estate and gift tax system,
Yep.
which means you can give wealth, this $19,000 a year in index for inflation. That's called an annual exclusion gift, no tax.
Yep.
You can also give 15 million. If you give nothing in your life, you will only have 15 million index for inflation at your death. That's excluded from the estate. It's exempt from the
Yep.
estate tax calculation. If you gave 15 million in life, you have no exemption left, but those assets are now outside of your estate.
Hmm.
So the name of the game is gift something with a low value today
That's going
that
to
will have an
appreciate.
extremely high value in the future.
Yeah.
And hopefully what you can do is start tipping the scale of what's in your estate versus what's out of your estate to minimize the estate tax.
I gotcha.
And if you're unable to do so, then you have a liquidity problem.
Yeah.
And the way that you solve the liquidity problem is typically with insurance.
Right. Hmm.
So, but even if you've reached 100 million, all is not lost. We can work, we work with clients to move assets outside of their estate in the most efficient way possible. I can't take $100 million and make it disappear and all of a sudden appear over here. But what
Yeah.
we can start doing is tipping the scales, moving assets that we think are going to appreciate and slowly minimize the future estate tax. We won't be able to eliminate it, but we can minimize the impact it'll have. And then also make sure that you have the liquidity to pay the tax and you're not selling assets in a fire sale to attempt to
Right.
pay the tax in the future. So all is not lost. There are structures that can be implemented to move wealth. We have clients come to us where to $100 million is not all that big of a problem. The real
Yeah.
problem is I started a tech company, I started a space company or whatever, a manufacturing business, and it's exploded to $1 billion. What do
Wow.
I do?
Yeah.
That's when the planning gets incredibly complicated. Um, but there's still things that those families do to minimize the estate tax. We can't eliminate it, but we can elect out of as much of it that we want to pay based on the structures that you put in place.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah, I think what might be interesting is maybe next time we talk a little bit about that from an estate planning perspective. What do I do if I've got a net worth of 1 million, 10 million, 100, and then you've got your billion dollar case study? Like, what are some moves that you would make on the chessboard in order to effectively plan now? And then I'd be curious as to how much or how many restrictions I would have with different moves I make right now, specifically being able to access my money conveniently versus how much will my family save when the money's eventually passed on from an estate tax standpoint? Because that's always like the question I have, meaning how much control am I potentially going to give up if I move assets out of my name, my business, something that I just go in and use like my mobile app, quite simple, to something else, a trust that I shouldn't really be using for personal use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that would
Yeah,
be awesome. And I'd be happy to talk through some of those planning options with you. Clients are going to fall into two buckets though. They're
yeah,
going to fall into, I've already generated the wealth and I have no planning.
yeah,
They have a different set of problems as opposed to, I know that I'm going to be successful. My business is going to take off. I see this happening in the next 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is. Help me plan to avoid this.
yeah,
Those people have a different set of problems, but they have more solutions.
yeah,
So planning while you're in the 3, 4, 5 million range, you're able to afford the planning and you're looking forward to potentially this huge exit in the future, because entrepreneurs tend to, even if they've exited one business, they're going to start another one, and
Yeah.
that business is going to kill it too, and they're going to keep growing and growing and growing. Having this planning early can set the stage to just make a couple right decisions that'll save a ton of money in the future. And even if the infrastructure, let's say the complicated infrastructure that's needed at a late stage development, you can sort of prime the pump where things are heading in the right direction and the planning is already, the basic apparatuses are in place where you're just sort of plugging new components onto the current chassis, which is where we get brought on to consult early
Yeah.
on. What sort of friction points are we looking for? How do we put together the least expensive, least complicated infrastructure now that hopefully projects the most massive benefit into the future, assuming things go well? And then if they knock it out of the park, they're already ahead of the game. And we can keep problem solving, keep planning, keep moving wealth, etc. It's an ongoing process
Yeah.
where,
Mhm.
where if you're buying a product, you likely got shoehorned into a plan that might not make sense in a few years. And
Right.
that's where you can run into problems with your trust example you're giving. You bought a product, you locked up all your assets in it, and now you're handcuffed, and it is
Yeah.
not the structure you wanted, etc. Which we do get brought on to figure out how bad is this? What can we do to fix this? And we'll help figure out an exit or a scenario that minimizes the downsides of their previous structure. So
Got it. Yeah.
yeah,
Is anything ever not fixable?
I mean, an irrevocable structure where
Hmm.
you've truly given up control is there's not a lot of solutions because, as the name would suggest, it's irrevocable. The
Hmm.
most that sometimes what we'll have to do is we'll actually have to have a sale where we sell out of the structure to, it doesn't solve the problem, but we freeze it. We lock the problem as where it is today and we move it somewhere else to a better structure. There's ways to fix things. It just depends on how, bad it really was.
Yeah. And then it costs money because it's a lot of
Setting up,
time. Yeah.
some things that'll happen is you set up an ESOP you didn't want to, you made an irrevocable trust and you didn't understand the implications of it. You over leveraged one planning mechanism to the detriment of others. You got in an entity with a partner who wasn't a good partner for you, and now you're trying to get out of that business. There's things like that we help negotiate and plan around.
Got it. Got it. Thanks for that. There's definitely a lot more that I want to ask you, but we are just about out of time here. Uh, one more question, which we kind of hit on this, but I think this one's the most important. Is if I want to pass money on, whether it's to my family or my employees, like that's a concern of mine. If something happens to me, like I want them to be taken care of, but I also want the money used responsible. How is that typically done? Is that just going back to the trust structure and having things organized where you're putting exactly what I want done in writing so the money's properly allocated?
I like going back to those sort of three guiding principles because I think that, so understand your why. What legacy are you trying to leave to your family and your employees? What
Hmm.
am I trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Really try to articulate that in a few sentences on a blank sheet of paper, write it out. Then study what other people have done. And you can accelerate that by hiring good advisors who can tell you the history. Here's what's worked for other people, blah, 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 blah. Then you sort of have a menu of options. And then finally, cultivate a bench of unconflicted advisors who are wise and have done it before, who can sort of look at this menu with you, with your lawyer or whoever you're working with, and help pick the option that makes the most sense for you.
Got it.
So it could be, I gave an ESOP, as an example of a bad solution. It could be a wonderful solution for your business to hand, you know, the wealth created by this company to your employees. It could be a mechanism in the operating agreement where key employees have an option right to buy your family out at your death. That could be a solution. It could be, I already have an amazing team. Um, they're just going to keep running it. And my family's just going to keep owning the business because there's no regulatory issue. That could be a fine solution. There's so many options. It could be I'm the CEO, I'm driving everything. I need liquidity to hire a new CEO. Maybe a key man insurance policy provides the necessary capital to hire that person or at least get you to an exit.
Right.
There's any number of solutions that make sense, but I like those three sort of guiding principles to lead you to the one that makes the most sense for you. Because otherwise, I'm going to be selling you a product and saying, this will work, trust me. And I'd
Yeah,
rather go through that process of finding what'll work just right for you and then implement it and maybe modify it as time goes on if the circumstances change.
I gotcha. Yeah. Why do I want to do this? What have others done? And then get some good advisors who I trust. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this. I sincerely appreciate it. I think next time we could probably go into some of those case studies we talked about at the different areas or different levels of net worth and the benefits of planning beforehand, and then what happens if you do it too late because you've got a good problem, frankly. But this has been fantastic. Thank you for your time, my friend. I appreciate it.
No problem. I love this stuff and
Yeah,
I'd love to have another conversation on the planning options. I'd enjoy
okay.
that a lot.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, until next time, we will talk to you soon. Thank you again, Brock. I appreciate your time.
No problem. Have a
All
good one.
right. You too. Thanks. Bye.